Chapter 1: The Illusion of Control. Charlotte Whitmore stepped confidently through the pristine terminal of JFK Airport, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor. The scent of luxury perfumes, freshly brewed coffee, and expensive cologne filled the air, a familiar cocktail of exclusivity that she had long associated with her lifestyle. Everything about air travel, at least the way she did it, was a seamless extension of her meticulously curated world. First-class lounges, priority boarding, champagne served in crystal flutes before takeoff. She barely acknowledged the staff who greeted her at the gate. Their deference was expected, not exceptional. With her tailored navy suit, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, and diamond bracelet glinting under the artificial lights, Charlotte exuded the aura of someone accustomed to power. She was, after all, one of the most influential women in her field, a high-ranking executive at a global consulting firm. Her reputation preceded her. The New York to London route was one she had taken dozens of times before. The flight was just another routine step in her schedule, a brief pause between boardroom meetings and exclusive networking events. She anticipated a smooth journey, as always, a glass of wine, a quiet meal, and perhaps a few hours of rest before landing at Heathrow. That was how first-class travel was supposed to be: refined, predictable, and above all, exclusive. As she stepped onto the plane and into the first-class cabin, she inhaled the scent of leather seats and premium service. She knew what to expect: the hushed, professional murmurs of business travelers, the rustling of newspapers, the occasional clinking of silverware. First class was supposed to be a sanctuary from the chaos of economy, a world where only the elite belonged. But as she reached her row, her poised stride faltered. Seated beside her in seat 3B was a man who didn't fit the usual mold. Tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a dark navy suit, the man exuded a quiet authority. His posture was relaxed yet assured, his fingers effortlessly gliding across the keyboard of an open laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated sharp, chiseled features, his dark skin smooth, his expression unreadable. He didn't look up as she arrived, utterly absorbed in whatever he was working on. Charlotte hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her designer carry-on. Something about him felt out of place. It wasn't that he was in a suit. Plenty of men in first class dressed well. It wasn't even that he seemed so at ease, as if he belonged there as much as she did. No, it was something deeper, something instinctive, something she couldn't quite put into words. She had traveled first class for years. She knew who she expected to see in this space, and whether she admitted it to herself or not, he wasn't it. She took a slow, measured breath and reminded herself that this was just another flight. Still, as she set down her tote, just a little too forcefully, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this trip had already gone wrong. Chapter 2: The Tension Builds. Charlotte settled into her seat, glancing at the man next to her again, Marcus Carter. The name was irrelevant for now, but everything about his presence was grating on her nerves. He sat there with such ease, his eyes focused on the screen of his laptop, completely absorbed in whatever he was doing. His dark skin was highlighted by the faint glow of the screen, his face sharp and angular. He had the kind of confidence that some people simply radiated, a self-assuredness that didn't need to be proven. He didn't look up at her. He didn't acknowledge her arrival. Charlotte, on the other hand, had her eyes locked on him the entire time. There was something unsettling about the way he fit into the first-class environment, yet didn't. In her mind, this was her space, and she had spent enough time traveling first class to know the unwritten rules. The first-class cabin was for professionals, for elites like herself. It wasn't a place for men who looked like they could have just walked out of a meeting in any other part of the world. And yet, here he was. She forced herself to look away. She adjusted the seatbelt over her perfectly tailored suit, crossing her legs with practiced grace. Her focus should be on the flight ahead, the work waiting for her when she landed in London. But it was impossible to ignore the man beside her. His quiet demeanor, the way he seemed to block her out entirely, only made it worse. The plane began to taxi toward the runway, and Charlotte felt the familiar hum of the engines below. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. Get a grip, she told herself. This was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. But still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced down at her phone, checking for work emails, scanning the latest news, anything to distract her from the discomfort settling in her chest. But her eyes inevitably drifted back to him. She shifted in her seat, nudging her purse slightly against his armrest, just enough to make her presence known. Nothing. No flinch. No response. Marcus remained focused on his laptop, fingers tapping away effortlessly as if he were completely unaware of her proximity. Charlotte's lips pressed together. The irritation was building now, threatening to spill over. She couldn't just sit there, pretending like everything was fine. This wasn't how first class was supposed to be. She inhaled sharply, straightening in her seat. She couldn't let him get away with this, whatever this was. She turned to him, her voice sweet yet sharp, carefully measured. "Excuse me," she said, forcing a smile. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Marcus didn't look up. His fingers never stopped typing. "Yes," he replied succinctly, without hesitation. Just like that. No explanation, no elaboration. His response felt dismissive, as if he didn't even care to engage with her. It was the ultimate insult. Charlotte blinked, feeling her pulse quicken. She cleared her throat, her fingers tightening around the edge of her seat. "Are you certain?" she repeated, glancing around subtly to see if anyone noticed the interaction. Again, nothing. This man, this stranger, was acting as if he had the right to take up space next to her without any questions. It was as if he didn't even see the problem. Her gaze flicked to the flight attendants as they moved through the cabin. She caught the eye of Jessica Powell, one of the senior attendants who had served her on numerous flights before. Jessica smiled politely, but Charlotte could already sense the familiar warmth in her expression. She raised her hand slightly, just enough to signal for Jessica's attention. A quick glance toward Marcus showed no change in his demeanor. He didn't even seem to notice her signal, as if everything around him was simply secondary to his work. Jessica approached, maintaining the polite distance that had come to define the flight attendants in first class. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" she asked, her voice calm but attentive. Charlotte forced a laugh, putting on the facade of a gracious traveler. "Oh, I think there's been a little mix-up," she said, her tone breezy. "I believe this gentleman is in the wrong seat." Jessica glanced at Marcus, whose fingers paused momentarily over the keyboard, but otherwise he didn't budge. His eyes were now on her, but there was no confusion in his gaze, no uncertainty. Jessica quickly pulled up the manifest on her tablet, scanning it with a practiced eye. "Actually, ma'am," she began, "Mr. Carter is in his correct seat. According to the manifest, he's in 3B and you're in 3A. Charlotte's face twitched. Her fingers curled around the armrest, a reflex of her rising frustration. "Are you sure?" she asked again, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Jessica's response was unwavering. "Yes, ma'am. Everything looks correct." Charlotte's mind raced, trying to process the information. It didn't make sense. She had never, not once, encountered a situation like this before. She turned back to the window, her jaw tightening. "Well," she muttered under her breath, "I suppose mistakes happen." But the seed of irritation had been planted, and it was starting to grow. This wouldn't be over. Not yet. Chapter 3. The pressure builds. Charlotte's grip on the armrest tightened as the plane began its final taxi to the runway. Her discomfort was palpable, but she refused to let it show. The faint hum of the engines felt like a distant echo compared to the turmoil churning inside her. She had always prided herself on being able to navigate any situation with grace and poise. But this was different. This man, Marcus Carter, seemed to defy every rule of propriety, and Charlotte couldn't let that slide. She glanced at Marcus again. He was still engrossed in his laptop, the screen casting a cold glow on his face. He didn't seem to notice her, and that only made her angrier. How could he act as if nothing was wrong? How could he just sit there, in her space, without acknowledging that he was an anomaly in first class? Her eyes flicked toward the front of the cabin. Jessica Powell, the lead flight attendant, was passing by, talking to another passenger. Charlotte didn't hesitate. She pressed the call button. Within moments, Jessica appeared by her side, her usual warm smile in place. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" she asked politely, her voice soft, professional. Charlotte's expression tightened as she glanced briefly at Marcus. "I think there's been some kind of mistake," she said, forcing a polite chuckle. "I believe this gentleman is in the wrong seat." Jessica's smile didn't falter. She glanced toward Marcus, who hadn't looked up, still tapping away at his laptop. Jessica's gaze lingered on him for a moment before pulling out her tablet. She quickly scanned the manifest. "Actually, ma'am, Mr. Carter is in his correct seat," Jessica explained. "It's clearly listed here. Seat 3B. Yours is 3A." Charlotte's heart sank, but she tried to mask it. Her fingers drummed lightly on the armrest, her breath growing shallow. "Are you absolutely sure?" she pressed, a hint of frustration seeping into her voice. "Yes, ma'am," Jessica confirmed, unfazed. "His seat assignment matches the ticket." Charlotte's face flushed, the irritation surging within her like a tidal wave. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had flown first class countless times, and never had she been put in a situation like this. The first class cabin was meant to be exclusive, not some place where strangers, especially men who didn't belong, could settle into. But now, there was nothing she could do except sit there, staring at the back of Jessica's head as the attendant moved away. But she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Charlotte's mind raced. The encounter felt all wrong, but she knew how to handle these situations. She had the power, and it was time to take control. She watched Jessica disappear into the galley, a few rows away. The thought of sitting next to Marcus, the man who, to her, represented everything she'd fought against in her carefully constructed life, gnawed at her. Without missing a beat, she pressed the call button again, this time with more urgency. Jessica returned, her expression still neutral, but now tinged with the slightest hint of impatience. "Is there something else I can assist you with, ma'am?" she asked, her voice a little more clipped than before. Charlotte sat up straighter in her seat, her body rigid. "I need to request a seat change," she said, her voice calm but firm. Jessica's brow furrowed for a brief moment. "Are you uncomfortable, ma'am?" she asked, her tone genuinely concerned. Charlotte hesitated for just a moment, making sure her words were measured. "It's not the seat," she said slowly, leaning in just enough to make her discomfort known. "I just don't feel comfortable sitting here. I think it would be best if I moved." Jessica glanced over at Marcus, who was still typing away on his laptop. His gaze met hers briefly, but he didn't say anything. He didn't even seem to care. Jessica bit her lip, then looked back at Charlotte. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but all of the first-class seats are taken. There's no availability." Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. "Are you sure?" she pressed again, her voice rising slightly. "I can't sit here with him." At this, Jessica hesitated for a fraction of a second. The tension in the air was palpable. But Jessica's composure never wavered. "Ma'am, I'm afraid there are no seats available in first class. Would you like me to check in economy?" she asked, her voice now more neutral, less accommodating. Charlotte's face flushed. "Economy? Are you out of your mind?" she snapped, her voice cutting through the calm of the cabin. "I don't belong there. I'm not asking for economy." Jessica stood silently for a moment, her patience clearly wearing thin, but she didn't budge. As Charlotte's frustration mounted, she could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. Several people had turned their heads, some pretending to check their phones, others whispering behind their hands. And she noticed someone was filming. Her pulse quickened. The thought of her discomfort becoming a spectacle in front of strangers, of it being captured on camera, made her stomach turn. She had to regain control. But as the flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles, Charlotte realized something she hadn't before. She wasn't the one holding the power anymore. And that, more than anything, terrified her. Chapter 4. The Breaking Point. The tension in the cabin was thickening, and Charlotte could feel it tightening around her like a noose. Her frustration was now fully bubbling to the surface, and she no longer cared to hide it. The polite smiles, the forced pleasantries, everything that had once made her feel like she could control any situation was slipping away. The more she tried to assert herself, the more it seemed that Marcus, and now Jessica, were undermining her power, and she couldn't stand it. Charlotte's hands trembled with anger as she straightened in her seat. The faint hum of the engine seemed to reverberate through her, amplifying her rising fury. This man doesn't belong here, she thought. This situation should not be happening, but nothing was changing. She couldn't back down, not now. "Jessica," Charlotte's voice was now sharp, edged with a tension that bordered on frantic. "I need to speak with the captain. This is completely unacceptable. I demand to speak with him right now." Her tone left no room for negotiation. Jessica blinked, clearly taken aback by Charlotte's sudden shift in demeanor. "Ma'am, I understand your discomfort, but there's nothing that can be done right now. I've already checked the manifest. Mr. Carter is in his assigned seat. There's no reason for him to move." Charlotte's patience, already thin, snapped. She couldn't stand how dismissive Jessica was being. This flight, this whole situation, felt like an attack on her status, her sense of control. The idea that someone, let alone a man like Marcus, could make her feel powerless was infuriating. "I don't care about the manifest," Charlotte shot back, her voice rising. She was no longer trying to hide her irritation. "I'm not sitting next to him, and if you don't do something about it, I will get off this plane right now." A tense silence fell over the cabin as Charlotte's words echoed through the first-class section. Passengers exchanged quick glances, the low hum of whispers now mingling with the quiet droning of the engines. Some seemed to hold their breath, while others were clearly uncomfortable with the growing drama. Jessica remained calm, though Charlotte could see the faint flicker of annoyance in her eyes. "Ma'am, I'm afraid there's nothing more I can do. The captain is preparing for takeoff, and I assure you we are operating within our guidelines." Charlotte's face reddened, her breath coming faster now, a mix of anger and embarrassment swirling inside her. She wasn't used to being disregarded, not by anyone, least of all a flight attendant. This wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about control. She had to make this right. She leaned forward, her voice rising, now loud enough that passengers in nearby seats were beginning to listen intently. "I don't feel safe," she stated with deliberate force, her eyes darting from Jessica to Marcus, who had not once reacted to the commotion. "I feel threatened. This man is a danger." The words hung in the air, a deliberate attempt to force the issue, to turn the tables. Her voice quivered slightly, but she was determined to make it seem like a serious accusation. It was a calculated move, her final attempt to regain control over the situation. The cabin, once quiet, now buzzed with uneasy energy. A few heads turned in her direction, and Charlotte could see the discomfort spreading across the faces of the other passengers. Some were starting to shift in their seats, no longer pretending not to notice. One man across the aisle whispered something to his companion, and a woman 2 rows behind Charlotte discreetly raised her phone, her camera already aimed in Charlotte's direction. Charlotte's mind raced, but the realization that people were recording this moment made her pulse quicken. This was a disaster. People were watching, and they were seeing her unravel. Was she really going to let this man ruin her image? Jessica stood firm, her expression now hardened, but she didn't flinch. "Ma'am," she said, her voice colder, more direct, "you cannot make such accusations without any basis. Right? If you truly feel unsafe, I'll have to ask you to deplane." Charlotte's stomach churned at the idea. She couldn't lose control like this. Not in front of everyone. Not in front of Marcus. Not in front of the camera phones now capturing every moment of her meltdown. But as her words faltered, Charlotte realized the impact of what she'd said. She'd crossed a line, and the reactions from those around her were immediate. The low murmurs of disapproval rippled through the cabin. A few passengers exchanged knowing glances. Some were even shaking their heads, clearly disapproving of Charlotte's actions. The man with the Bluetooth earbud across the aisle chuckled quietly, a mocking smile tugging at his lips. The woman with the phone didn't stop recording. Charlotte's face burned with humiliation as she sat back in her seat, her chest tightening. The situation was spiraling out of control. What had started as a minor discomfort had now turned into a public spectacle. Marcus, for his part, still hadn't reacted. He remained seated, his eyes still on his laptop, as though none of this concerned him. But that made Charlotte's blood boil even more. He was untouchable, unbothered, and it made her feel small. And that was when it hit her. She wasn't just losing control of the flight. She was losing control of her entire carefully crafted world. Chapter 5, The Unexpected Reveal. The cabin was still buzzing with low whispers and uncomfortable glances as Charlotte sat back in her seat, her chest heaving with anger and embarrassment. Her voice had risen, her words had become more pointed, and now it seemed there was no turning back. The eyes of the other passengers were like heat-seeking missiles, all aimed squarely at her. She could feel the weight of their gazes, and it only fueled her outrage. Why wasn't anyone doing anything? Why wasn't anyone stepping in to stop this man from making her feel small? She had become the spectacle now, the center of attention, and it infuriated her even more. But then, just as she was about to speak again, to escalate things further, something unexpected happened. Marcus Carter, the man who had remained silent throughout her entire outburst, finally moved. Slowly, methodically, as if he had been waiting for this moment, he closed his laptop. The soft click of the device shutting down was almost like a signal, a sharp break in the tension that had been building. Charlotte watched as he lifted his gaze from the now closed laptop, locking eyes with her for the first time since their initial interaction. And in that instant, everything changed. The calmness in his eyes was unsettling. There was no anger, no sign of irritation or fear, just a steady, cold confidence. He didn't raise his voice, didn't flinch. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. He flipped it open. The gleaming gold emblem inside caught the light of the cabin, and Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. It was an FBI badge. The words on the badge were clear: Federal Bureau of Investigation. Charlotte's heart stopped. Her pulse raced, her mind scrambling to process what she was seeing. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't gloat. His expression was unreadable, but there was something piercing about the way he looked at her now. "If you feel unsafe," he said, his voice steady, almost mechanical, "I can take your statement right here. We can make an official report." His words hung in the air, deliberate and heavy. The implication was clear. This wasn't just a man sitting in the seat next to her. This was someone who had the authority to make her accusations matter in ways she couldn't comprehend. For a long moment, the entire cabin fell into an eerie silence. It was the kind of quiet that only comes with a revelation so stunning that no one knows how to react. Charlotte could feel the weight of every single passenger's gaze now. Some were wide-eyed in disbelief, others with their mouths slightly agape. A few gasped quietly. But all Charlotte could do was stare at Marcus. The sound of the engine, the murmurs of the passengers, the faint rustling of newspapers, everything faded into a dull hum. Her mind was racing, her thoughts tumbling over each other, but she couldn't focus on anything but the badge. Her mouth went dry. The weight of the situation crashed down on her with such intensity that she could barely breathe. "Do you need a moment?" Marcus asked, his voice unwavering. The words didn't make sense. She had tried to have him removed from his seat, tried to cast doubt on his presence, tried to imply that he was a threat, and now he was the one who had the power. Charlotte's body went rigid. For the first time since she had boarded the plane, she felt truly trapped. Every exit, every excuse she had crafted, dissolved in an instant. This was no longer a battle of discomfort. This was a confrontation with someone who wasn't just any man. He was a federal agent. The silence stretched on. Charlotte's mouth opened, but no words came out. There was nothing she could say. Marcus, still as calm and composed as ever, slowly closed the wallet, tucked it back into his jacket, and picked up his laptop again, resuming his work as if nothing had happened. But for Charlotte, everything had changed. She had underestimated him, misjudged him in a way she could never undo. The entire flight, her entire world, had shifted. The cabin, once alive with the murmur of conversation and tension, now felt like a suffocating vacuum. Charlotte could hear her own heartbeat, the blood rushing in her ears, as the gravity of the situation settled in. She was no longer in control. She was exposed. And for the first time, she felt real fear. Not because of anything Marcus had done, but because of everything she had done. Chapter 6. Immediate Consequences. The silence in the cabin was suffocating, heavy with the realization that Charlotte had lost control, not just of the situation, but of her carefully constructed world. Marcus had made his point. The FBI badge had shattered her illusion of power, and she was left staring, frozen in place, as he nonchalantly resumed typing on his laptop. For a moment, Charlotte sat there, her mind racing, but the words she had built up in her head, the ones she thought would right the situation, now seemed pointless. The entire flight, the passengers around her, the uncomfortable tension that had clouded the cabin, it all felt like a cruel, unrelenting spotlight on her. But as the realization fully hit her, something else began to happen. The whispers started to grow. From the back of the cabin, a muffled chuckle broke the silence. A man, sitting across the aisle from Charlotte, let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. He wasn't trying to hide it. He was openly amused. Soon, others joined in. The low murmur turned into a ripple of laughter, like a wave cascading through the cabin. Charlotte felt her face flush with embarrassment, her blood rushing to her head. She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. She could feel her body go rigid as the reality of what had just transpired settled in. Her confrontation, the accusations, the outright spectacle, everything was unfolding before her eyes in a way she couldn't control. Then, from somewhere further down the aisle, she heard a slow, deliberate round of applause. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The man who had been sitting in the row across from Charlotte was clapping, his hands coming together with a deliberate rhythm. It wasn't a warm, friendly clap. It was mocking, almost sarcastic. Some passengers followed suit, the faint sound of clapping growing louder. Charlotte's stomach twisted. She felt exposed, a sense of shame creeping up her spine. Her actions, her desperate attempts to regain control, had turned her into the punchline of some sick joke. And then there was Jessica. The flight attendant who had maintained an air of professionalism throughout the entire ordeal now stood by the galley, watching Charlotte with an almost knowing smile. It wasn't a smile of sympathy. It wasn't one of comfort. It was an expression filled with quiet understanding, as if she knew exactly what was happening, and more importantly, that Charlotte had already sealed her own fate. Charlotte's hands clenched into fists on her lap, the force of her anger starting to overpower the sinking feeling in her stomach. She couldn't believe what was happening. Her mind screamed that this wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to be the one in control, the one who dictated the narrative. Instead, she had become the subject of ridicule, a woman exposed for her own prejudices. She glanced around the cabin, desperate to find an ally, a familiar face that might give her some shred of support. But all she saw were faces turned away, some pretending not to notice, others openly staring. Even the woman sitting in the row behind her had her phone out, discreetly pointing it toward Charlotte. The soft tap of a screen confirmed what Charlotte already knew. Someone was recording. The woman with the phone quickly adjusted her position, angling it for a clearer shot. Charlotte's heart sank. The video was already out there, and it would spread like wildfire. This moment, this catastrophic failure, would be shared with the world. She couldn't take it back. She had no control over it anymore. And just like that, Charlotte realized the full weight of her mistake. The laughter, the clapping, the recording, it all pointed to one undeniable truth: she had already lost. Chapter 7, The Aftermath. As the plane touched down on the tarmac at Heathrow, Charlotte felt like she was in a daze. The steady hum of the engines faded, and the sounds of the cabin shifted as passengers began to gather their belongings. For a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. The flight had ended, and everything would return to normal. But it hadn't. The moment the seatbelt sign turned off and passengers stood up, Charlotte felt the weight of what had happened crash down on her with all the subtlety of a freight train. As she retrieved her carry-on, the buzz of her phone echoed through the cabin, a sound she had learned to ignore in the past. But now, it felt like a sharp, cutting reminder of what awaited her. She checked the screen. 1 missed call, 2 unread emails, a dozen text messages. Her stomach churned as she opened the first email, already knowing what it was going to say. "Charlotte, we need to talk urgently." It was from her boss. The subject line alone sent a chill down her spine. She quickly glanced at the next message. "What were you thinking?" Her partner's words were blunt, and the message had come in just a few minutes after her email. But it was the third notification that made her hands tremble. She opened the message with dread, already bracing for impact. The email was from her consulting firm. Her stomach twisted as she read the words that were now burned into her mind. "We do not condone discriminatory behavior. Charlotte Whitmore is no longer our representative." The words felt like a slap in the face. A public accusation, a company distancing itself from her, the loss of everything she had worked so hard for. She tried to keep her composure, but it was impossible. The more she read, the more the reality of the situation set in. Her reputation, the one she had so carefully crafted, was disintegrating before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Charlotte's hands were shaking now. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to breathe, trying to steady herself. But it felt like everything had collapsed around her in the span of a single flight. She reached for her phone again, swiping through the text messages. One was from a former colleague, asking her if the video was true. Another was from an old friend, offering support, but Charlotte knew it was too late for any of that. The video was already out there. It had gone viral. She could already see it, spreading across social media, being shared over and over again. The recording of her moment of humiliation, her attempt to have a man removed from his seat simply because he didn't fit her idea of who belonged in first class. She stepped off the plane and into the terminal, her mind a blur. But as she approached the baggage claim area, the reality hit her again. There, waiting in front of her, were the reporters. The cameras were rolling, microphones poised. One reporter, a woman with short black hair, spotted her immediately. She stepped forward, her eyes lighting up as soon as she saw Charlotte. "Miss Whitmore, is it true that you tried to have an FBI agent removed from his seat because of his race? Would you like to comment on the viral video?" Charlotte's legs went weak. The words were cutting, and she felt the air leave her lungs. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She could feel her chest tightening, her heart pounding in her ears. But the reporter didn't wait for an answer. She pressed on, the camera rolling in her face. "We've seen the video. Over 500,000 views in just a few hours. What do you have to say for yourself?" Charlotte couldn't think. Her mind was in a fog. The weight of the situation, the cameras, the reporters, the public scrutiny, crushed her. She tried to move past them, but the questions kept coming. She stumbled forward, a sense of dread washing over her with every step. She felt the eyes of the crowd on her, the whispers, the silent judgment. Her reputation, everything she had built, was already crumbling, and she was powerless to stop it. By the time Charlotte reached her hotel, her phone buzzed again. This time, the text came from her sister. "I saw the video. Charlotte, what happened? I'm so sorry." Charlotte stared at the screen, her heart sinking further. There was no coming back from this. The storm was just beginning, and her world was already falling apart. Chapter 8, The Haunting End. Charlotte stumbled through Heathrow Airport, her hands clammy, her heart pounding, as she desperately tried to keep her composure. Every step she took felt like it led her deeper into the trap she had set for herself. The reporters were still following her, their questions sharp, their cameras flashing as they pressed her for a response. She wanted to scream, to push them away, but the words stuck in her throat. The embarrassment was suffocating, and the overwhelming sense of dread made it feel like the walls of the airport were closing in around her. She needed to get out. She needed to escape before it all became too much to bear. As she neared the exit, her phone buzzed again, but she couldn't bring herself to check it. The last few notifications she had received, each one more damning than the last, had already been enough to send her into a spiral of panic. Her company had dropped her. Her name was trending for all the wrong reasons. The video was everywhere, and people were already taking sides. Charlotte's vision blurred, and she kept her head down, trying to avoid the stares of the few remaining passengers milling around. But just as she reached the door, she saw him. Marcus Carter. He walked past her, his gait smooth, his expression calm, entirely unaffected by the chaos around him. He had his phone in hand, speaking into it with a steady voice, as if the world hadn't just exploded around her. "Yes, I'll be there in an hour," he said, his tone measured, as if he were simply discussing the details of an ordinary workday. "It's a standard operation. I'll brief you when I arrive." Charlotte's chest tightened. He was so calm, so composed. And then, without so much as a glance in her direction, Marcus paused just long enough to look at her briefly. His eyes locked with hers for a brief moment, unimpressed, unbothered, as if he had already moved on from this entire situation. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging her existence only in passing. "Just another day," he murmured softly, his words so casual they hit Charlotte like a blow to the chest. And then, just like that, he walked past her, his footsteps echoing as he made his way toward the exit. Charlotte stood there, frozen, her heart racing, her legs unable to move. The sight of him leaving, of him walking away from the storm she had created, only deepened the suffocating weight that pressed down on her chest. It was like he didn't even care. It was like her entire breakdown, her desperate need to regain control, hadn't even mattered. Marcus was already back to his life, his real life, the one she had no place in. The irony hit her hard. He was the one who had held the power all along. He hadn't needed to prove anything. He had remained calm, unshaken by her attempts to remove him, to make him feel small. And now, as the wreckage of her reputation lay in shambles, he was moving on as if nothing had happened. Charlotte's gaze remained fixed on him until he was gone, disappearing into the crowd. She swallowed hard, but the bitter taste of defeat wouldn't go away. The message had never been clearer. Prejudice can destroy the life of the person who holds it. Charlotte had been the one to judge, the one to make assumptions, and in doing so, she had become the villain in a story she couldn't rewrite. And as the voices of the reporters grew louder behind her, Charlotte couldn't help but realize that the internet never forgets. Her mistake had been recorded, shared, and spread far and wide. She had tried to remove a man from his rightful place, but in the process, she had erased herself from the pedestal she had once stood on. True power, she now understood, wasn't something you could assert through forceful demands or manipulation. Those who truly wielded it, like Marcus, didn't need to show it. They simply carried it with them, unnoticed, as they moved through the world. The story of Charlotte and Marcus serves as a powerful reminder of how prejudice and bias can shape our actions and perceptions, often leading to destructive consequences. In everyday life, we may not always realize the weight our assumptions carry and how they can harm others or even ourselves. Charlotte's initial discomfort was rooted in a biased view of who belongs in certain spaces, which ultimately led to her public downfall. This teaches us that judgment based on superficial traits, such as race, class, or appearance, not only damages relationships, but also erodes our own integrity. Moreover, the story highlights the importance of humility and self-awareness. True power doesn't come from trying to control others or impose our will, but from understanding, respect, and the ability to stay composed in the face of conflict. The internet's unforgiving nature reminds us to be cautious with our words and actions, as they can have long-lasting impacts in a connected world.